Hey everyone, this is day one of the judicial branch. This will be probably a 4 or 5 day unit, and this is just getting some of the basics out of the way to get us started. So we do the judicial branch separate from another chapter, which is probably for most the most interesting one on civil rights and civil liberties. So that will be our next one. So I just wanted to get started on what is in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say a lot about the judicial branch. It's a very short unit, I guess, very short chapter. Article 3 of the Constitution says there will be a Supreme Court. It doesn't say how many judges or how old they have to be or no qualifications, nothing like that. It just says there will be a Supreme Court, and then Congress can make other courts, which they've done. It says judges hold office while on good behavior, which basically equals life, unless they get impeached because of bad behavior. Their salary can't be lowered, and then there's it's maybe a little unclear to some. There are some who would argue judicial review is in the Constitution, but we'll just say that it's not, and it comes about in Marbury versus Madison. The Supreme Court can hear both general types of cases. They are given the authority in the Constitution to hear cases of original jurisdiction, which means they're the ones who hear the case for the first time. So those would be pretty rare instances, though. That would be something like a state challenging another state, where it doesn't make sense to have the case be heard in one of the state's courts because it seems biased. So original jurisdiction case would be like a dispute on the North Carolina-South Carolina border, and that would go right to the Supreme Court. Now, stuff like that, and there are a couple other types, but that doesn't happen very often. So appellate jurisdiction is the one most likely to for the Supreme Court to hear, which appellate jurisdiction is just the right to hear cases on appeal. And a whole lot of cases get appealed to the Supreme Court every year, and they are going to hear fewer than 100. The Supreme Court was in the Constitution very weak. It's still probably most would say is the weakest of the three branches. Members could be removed by, and it depends what you mean by remove, but by death, resignation, or impeachment. And then it was unclear whether they had judicial review or not. I wanted to look at two of the required documents by the College Board for the AP test. Federalist 78 is the authors of the Federalist Papers, in this case Hamilton, just arguing for the Supreme Court and why you should not worry about it. So I'm not going to go over all of this, but I put some of the main excerpts from this, and in this first one paragraph at the top, I'll go over most of this, just because what they do in the Federalist Papers is they'll say, like, one of them will say, I know some of you are worried about the Senate, but don't worry, this is why it's the least powerful part of the new government. And then they'll say, some of you are about the president, but I know that here's why it's the least powerful part. And then do the same thing with the court here. And obviously all those things can't all be true. But so anyway, so whoever attentively considers the different departments of power must perceive that in a government in which they are separated from each other, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution, because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. The executive not only dispenses the honors, but holds the sword of the community. So the executive especially controls the military. The legislature not only commands the purse, so they control the budget, but prescribes the rules by which the duties and rights of every citizen are to be regulated. The judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over either the sword, the military, or the budget, no direction either of the strength or of the wealth of society, and can take no active resolution whatsoever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. So no active resolution. The thinking is, don't worry about the court, because the court can only address something when somebody else starts the case and challenges it to the Supreme Court. They can't do anything on their own. And then without reading this next part, if you skim over these next two little paragraphs I took out, they do suggest that the job of the court is to declare unconstitutional acts unconstitutional. And so there is some belief that the founders sort of assumed there would be judicial review, but it's not clearly spelled out in the Constitution. So that's why Marbury versus Madison becomes so important. Now, Brutus, in this case, Brutus 12, from the Anti-Federalist Papers, says there appears evident from this consideration that the legislature passed laws which, in the judgment of the court, they are not authorized to do by the Constitution. The court will not take notice of them, for it will not be denied that the Constitution is the highest or supreme law, and the courts are vested with the supreme and uncontrollable power to determine in all cases that come before them what the Constitution means. They cannot, therefore, execute a law which in their judgment opposes the Constitution unless we can suppose they can make a superior law give way to an inferior. Basically, one of the Anti-Federalist authors is also suggesting that the court in the Constitution has the authority to declare laws unconstitutional. So again, I'm throwing those excerpts out because from both Hamilton's work and then from this Anti-Federalist work, they're basically suggesting that they do have the ability to declare laws unconstitutional, which we always say is created in Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury versus Madison, again, with a live session, normally I would go over this case in a lot more detail. I'm not going to do that. I don't think it's necessary, but what you should take away is that what starred right there, that Marbury versus Madison establishes clearly the principle of judicial review, allowing the courts the ability to declare laws that acts of Congress and also executive orders and other acts of the government unconstitutional if they deem them to be unconstitutional. And so that was the most important thing. John Marshall was the Chief Justice. The court pretty much had no real responsibility before Marbury versus Madison. Very, very rarely heard cases. And in fact, the year before the case, that Congress actually wouldn't let them meet. So they actually had a year off. And so Marbury versus Madison basically says the court can declare acts of other branches of government unconstitutional if they are. And so that's the big part of that case. McCulloch v. Maryland, we've already mentioned twice, where this is going to sort of further. This is the same Chief Justice. John Marshall will be Chief Justice in McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden. And in both of these cases, he's going to reaffirm this belief of the national government as supreme over other levels of government. And so remember that in McCulloch v. Maryland, the state of Maryland tried to tax the national bank. And in this, so the court says, no, you can't. The state can't tax the nation because that'd be like putting the state above the nation. And also, the federal government, we're going to give them the ability to make a national bank, even though it's not listed in the Constitution. So that is going to expand the power, allow for the expansion of the power of the government. In Gibbons v. Ogden, it is an issue with a federal license versus a state license, and there were steamboats going from New Jersey to New York. And there was a conflict there. And basically, the two issues decided were national supremacy. The national control over whatever the issue is going to be supreme. And they're also going to decide, they're going to declare that transporting people is commerce. It's a form of interstate commerce. So basically, Marbury versus Madison gives the court a job. McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden increased the power of the federal government. And those are all John Marshall cases. So those were very important cases early on in our country's history to kind of pave the way for it to become what it has become. Then what happens then is so the federal government was sort of the court was ruling in favor of the federal government. We'll finish with Dred Scott v. Sanford. And Chief Justice Roger Taney was a Southern, basically slave holding. He basically was a Southern. If it was the case, now he was not like a soldier in the Civil War or anything, but he would be a supporter of the Confederacy in the Civil War. So he was a Southerner, states' rights person. And so a case came up, Dred Scott v. Sanford. And I touched on this in the federalism unit, but in this case, we always, if you hear about it in history class, you always think of the slave Dred Scott. Dred Scott was brought by his owner to a free state and then brought back to the South. And so he was suing for his freedom. He said, if I'm a slave and I'm brought to a free state, I can't be a slave anymore, so I should be a free person. So the court sort of throws his case out, and they say, no, you're a slave, you're a piece of property, you're not even a person, you're not even allowed to sue. And so too bad. And they say that the slave owner, to bring a slave to a free state, is just like a horse or a mule, they compare it to. And they say, look, he doesn't lose his property by going to a free state. So the slave stays a slave. So that part scared a lot of Northerners who were thinking, wait a minute, if we ban slavery in the North, they can still bring slaves up here and they can get slaves. That doesn't make sense. But the bigger issue in this, which I touched on briefly in the federalism chapter, is Dred Scott v. Sanford. The other part of this was he basically the court said, not only are we going to not allow him to sue, but we are going to declare all the acts of Congress that had been in place that had banned slavery in the territories, in territories for them to become states. When they became states, they would not be allowed to have slavery. So there was the Northwest Ordinance, there was the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, I should say, and there was the Compromise of 1850. And so basically what the court does is they say we're going to get rid of all those. So whereas one of the compromises had made the 3630 line basically a line of latitude, where they had said from this point on we're going to draw a line, basically sort of the southern part of Missouri. We're going to draw a line right across to California, and all the area north of that, those were territories. But when they became states, they would be able to decide for themselves now if they wanted slavery, even though that the law had banned slavery in those territories north of the line. So basically what the court said is we're going to give, even though the first part of it where you could bring a slave to the north and keep slavery, that doesn't seem like a states' rights decision. It seems like a southern states' rights decision. This part of it, in a way, was a states' rights decision, because what they're saying is if it's unconstitutional for the court to ban slavery in future states, because the court was saying at the time, almost every state in America at the time was slave or free because the state got to decide. So New York was free because they voted for it to be free. They decided for it to be free. North Carolina was slave at the time because they wanted to be a slave state. So he's saying those territories north of the 3630 line, when they become states, they should get the same rights as the other places in the East. So, but that scared a lot of Northerners too, and it made them think, oh my gosh, we could have slavery everywhere, all over the place. Slave states could outnumber free slaves states, and so they didn't like that. And that's seen, Dred Scott is sometimes seen then as a cause of the Civil War. So basically what I'm trying to show you is that it went from federal government decisions, then we transitioned into states' rights, states' power decisions around the time of the Civil War. So Dred Scott was in 1857. And remember, the Civil War was 1861 to 65. But you're going to see in history a transition of federal, decisions, and then more states' rights, and more federal decisions, and kind of now a little bit more states' decisions. So we'll pick up right after Dred Scott tomorrow. Thank you.